This is always an interesting topic because there are so many opinions and so little real science around these issues. So today going to try to give you an overview of what we know about gender-specific issues for women with a history of chemical dependence and how that has an impact on the kinds of services you deliver not only to the women themselves, but their families and especially their children. Now, we're going to start with something that all of you are quite familiar with, the ACEs study. As you know, this was a study published by Kaiser Permanente that looked at adverse childhood experiences. And they defined those experiences in a variety of ways. They're listed here: emotional abuse, physical abuse, contact sexual abuse, or growing up in a household that's affected by alcoholism or substance abuse in the family, a family member who's imprisoned, mental illness in the household, or neither biological parent is present. The interesting thing about this study is it showed that if an individual suffered any of these difficulties during early childhood, these difficulties translated into both biological and social dysfunction as long as 50 years later. So that what we see is in individuals, and the more positive ACEs factors that an individual has, the more likely that individual is to suffer heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, social difficulties, and mental illness. So this was published in 2003. Prior to that, we had been looking at some of these same issues, specifically in women who were pregnant and using and abusing drugs. And so I want to tell you a little bit about those women because you'll see that it's quite informative as we move forward. First of all, this was a study of 75 women who were enrolled in our substance abuse treatment program. And we compared them to a matched set of women from the same neighborhoods, the same population, who were similar in every way except they had no history or evidence of substance use or abuse, either prior to or during pregnancy. The average age for each of the groups was similar, as was the racial distribution. As you can see, the great majority in both groups were African American because that's where we built our program, was in the middle of the African American neighborhoods of the inner city of Chicago. All of the women were living well below poverty level. They had an average educational level of 11 years, and their drug use history was such that the women with histories of substance use were polydrug users for an average of 10 years. And as I said before, the control group had no history or evidence of substance use. Now, we looked at several factors and did a study of the women's psychosocial background to see if we could find any common threads. And I want to give you an overview of the 6 factors that we found most specifically were related to women with histories of chemical dependence. The first was a negative heritage. Some people might call that a family history. But similar to what the ACEs study found, is we found a good number of the women who were currently using drugs or alcohol during pregnancy had a family history of substance abuse. Interestingly, it was much more evident that the mother of these women had the problems with substance use as opposed to the father. If you look, for example, at alcohol problems, 35% of the women who were using drugs and alcohol had a mother who was using during the woman's childhood, and 42% had a father who was using. And among the non-drug users, none of them had a mother who had been using, though 24% had a father who had been using. So the statistically significant difference between the two groups here was in the mother's the woman's mother's use of alcohol during the woman's childhood. This same pattern held true for illicit drug use, whereas 11% of the women who had a history of drug use during pregnancy, 11% had a mother who had been using, only 3% of the women in the control group, and the father 17 and 11%. So what you have here again is the only statistical significance was the difference between the rate of use by the mothers of the drug using women, and that rate was significantly higher than for the non-using women. Another important factor is the woman's history of relationships during her childhood. Now, this is commonly called attachment. Attachment is the interconnectedness between human beings. And so we had several questions that we could look at to tell us a little bit about the woman's relationship with her own family, especially her own mother. One of the questions was, did anyone ever tell you when you were a child that you were worthless? 61% of the women with a history of drug use or alcohol use versus 13% of the women with no such history could recall a specific time in which she was told that she was worthless. And in almost every case, she was told this by her own mother. One of the other questions was, when you were a child, did you ever feel unwanted or unloved? 67% of the women in the drug and alcohol use group versus 15% in the non-using group. As a child, how close did you feel to your mother? Very close, somewhat close, neutral, distant, very distant. 28% of the drug-using women had felt very close to their mothers, with 32% feeling very distant, versus the non-using women, 62% versus 5%. So what you get here is a picture of women with current histories of substance use during pregnancy, who, when you go back to their childhood, had a very poor or difficult relationship with their own family, especially their own mother. And this is a significant difference between the two groups in our study. The second issue is exposure to violence. Now, there are national studies that show that 80 to 90% of women who are using substances as adults have a history of violence. When we looked at this issue closely, we found especially that sexual violence was a significant problem. And in fact, from our studies in Chicago, this study, as well as some studies we did in North Carolina, we found that if a woman tells you that her first drug or alcohol use was before the age of about 11 years, what you know most likely happened was that the woman was given that drug or the alcohol by a perpetrator who got her high or drunk and then molested her. Now think about what impact that would have on an individual's long-term outcome. In addition, when looking at current issues, we found in the substance using group high rates of domestic violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, a history of having been raped, and a loss of a loved one to a violent death. These were all statistically significant from the women in the control group, except the final category, loss to a violent death. Now, as I mentioned, all of these women came from the inner city of Chicago, and so all had suffered, or equal percentages of the women had lost a loved one to a violent death, which in Chicago usually translates into a drive-by shooting. But if you look at these patterns, you can see high rates of abuse, especially sexual abuse and violence, in the history of the women with a history of substance use. And again, let me go back to the ACEs study. This coincides exactly with what was found in the ACEs study. The third factor is lack of social support. One of the key differences between men and women when it comes to human development is that women's lives revolve around relationships. This is much different from men. Women's lives revolve around relationships with other women, with their own children, with their significant other. Children who grow up in a home with violence, with substance abuse, we refer to those families as avoidant families. They avoid systems of care, they avoid social contacts. And what we find is that children who grow up socially isolated grow into adults who are socially isolated. So many times the women we're talking about have very little support in any kind of social system. And one way we looked at this was we asked the simple question, I can rely on, and 32% of the women could, in the substance using group, could rely on the father of their baby, while only 50% of the women in the non-use group. A friend was similar. The only statistically significant difference was in the last group, I can rely on my mother. Only 39% of the women in the substance using group versus 63% in the non-use group. And this shows you the degree of social isolation. If there's any one question that you can ask during the prenatal period that will give you a sense of this, and also a sense of the welfare of the child long term, you can ask this question. Who can you rely on to help you with your baby? If a woman can't name at least 3 people upon which she can rely to help her with her baby, you know you have a high-risk situation. And you have to help that woman find the social support systems she can rely on. And this is when home visiting, when other social service agencies can step forward. The fourth issue is cognitive functioning. Now, most people assume that someone with a long history of alcohol and drug abuse would also suffer cognitively. And in fact, we do find in general that the IQs tend to be a little lower. But that's talking about global cognitive functioning. What I'd like to show you here are some studies of MRIs that were done on 2 different women. Now on your left, the left of your screen, top and bottom, are 2 cuts through an MRI for a woman with no history of substance abuse, and it is what you would call a typical or normal woman. And those are normal MRIs on the left, top and bottom. On the right, you can see top and bottom. The MRIs, the same cuts through the brain, but these 2 cuts of the MRI are from a woman with a long history of alcoholism. Now let's compare the top 2 on the left and the right. And very quickly you can see the difference that on the right, in the woman with a long history of alcoholism, the black spaces are larger. Those black spaces are called ventricles. And the ventricles are essentially the holes in the brain through which spinal fluid flows, through which the brain receives its nutrition. And what you see there is that alcohol kills brain cells. And what you've got is as brain cells around the ventricles die off, the ventricles dilate. And this has an impact on global cognitive functioning. The bottom 2 MRIs are the same cuts, left and right. On the left is the normal. On the right is the woman with a history of alcoholism. And again, you can locate the ventricles, the black holes in the middle, and look right above the ventricles. You see a kind of U-shaped organ. That U-shaped organ is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is responsible for moving information from one side of the brain to the other. Now, look at the MRI on the bottom right. Find the corpus callosum. And what you see here, just above the ventricles, the very broad U-shaped structure now, this is the corpus callosum as a result of chronic alcoholism. You get thinning of the corpus callosum. Now, this is significant because the corpus callosum is responsible for moving information from one side of the brain to the other, for integrating information, for helping you make sense of information that is bombarding your brain. And if you have a thin corpus callosum, you're going to have difficulty putting things together, moving information from one side of the brain to the other. And this affects learning, it affects day-to-day behavior, and it affects the way the woman can understand the information you're giving to her in your psychoeducational groups and through therapy. Now, moving from alcohol, this is a different kind of brain scan. This is called a PET scan. PET scans are such that you inject dye into the individual, and then you can do the scan. And what PET scans show is the dopamine system. Now, these are two PET scans, left and right. Now, on the left is a young man, 22 years old, and this is a normal PET scan. So he had a PET scan done, and you can see the dopamine showing up as yellow and red. So that's the dopamine receptor system. Now, one of the effects of methamphetamine use, cocaine use, nicotine use, is that it does deplete the dopamine receptors. And this young man, as a matter of fact, did start using methamphetamine after this PET scan was done. When a repeat PET scan was done, you can see that the yellow and red are missing. He has depleted his dopamine receptors. Now, dopamine exists in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, and it's responsible for regulatory behaviors. Dopamine is known as the regulatory center of the brain. And when someone has depleted dopamine receptors, what you get is dysregulated behaviors. The fifth factor is psychological functioning. Now, one of the things we know about women with histories of substance abuse, compared to men, is that women have higher rates of co-occurring mental health disorders. And in our own research, what we have found, the two mental health difficulties most commonly seen in the women in our programs are depression and feelings of self-esteem, lower feelings of self-esteem. We also see high rates of borderline personality. Now think about that and how if an individual has borderline personality, is depressed, has low feelings of self-worth, self-esteem, how does that affect that individual's relationship with you as the therapist? And, of course, how is that going to affect her relationship with her child? Another way of looking at this is looking at personality. And this is from one study we did with this large population of women. And what we found, we used the MMPI to look at personality characteristics. We found that 50% of the women in the substance-using group, as compared to only about 15% of the women in the normed group, had elevations of scale 4 on the MMPI, which means they had difficulty maintaining satisfactory relationships, they profited little from experience, and they were very poor at anticipating consequences of their behavior. And if you think back to the scans, the brain scans I just showed you, when you have a thin corpus callosum, when you have depletion of your dopamine receptors, you're going to have difficulty learning from experience or understanding the consequences of behavior. So this all fits together from a biologic as well as a psychological perspective. There also was some elevation of scale 8, meaning the women had thought disorders, as well as scale 6, paranoid symptoms. Now, these two did not reach statistically significant elevated levels as compared to the control group, but they were borderline reaching significance. So I am just showing them to you. The sixth factor is in the arena of substance abuse itself. Because as we've been talking, we've seen that one of the consistent difficulties is in relationships. We talked about social isolation as a child, social isolation as an adult, having someone to depend on. And so what is the biology of relationships? Or in this sense, what is the biology of attachment? Let's start where I have the asterisk in this cycle. We're going to start with the brain. There are two systems that are actively engaged when an individual attaches to another individual. It's the dopamine pathway, which we've talked about, and oxytocin. Now, what happens when a woman becomes pregnant? The dopamine and the oxytocin responses are what help her begin to attach to her unborn child. And so maternal fetal attachment is driven by dopamine and oxytocin responses. As the mother engages, she stimulates the development of the dopamine and oxytocin systems in the developing fetus. So when the baby is born, the infant's attachment behavior is rooted in these biological pathways, the dopamine and oxytocin systems. You have ongoing environmental influences, of course, as well as genetics and epigenetics. But as the individual grows, these two systems, dopamine and oxytocin, drive adult attachment strategies, and we're back where we started in the circle. So that's what we see in a normal, from a physiologic perspective, in a normally developing attachment strategy. However, I've already shown you the effect of substance abuse. The particular case I showed you was methamphetamine use on the dopamine receptor system. But we also now know that the chronic administration of drugs of abuse, such as opiates or cocaine or methamphetamine, reduces oxytocin levels in the brain, specifically in the hypothalamus. So what does that do to our cycle of attachment? In the adult, the pregnant woman, you have depressed oxytocin. You also have disruption of the dopamine pathways. And so this affects the woman's attachment, the development of her relationship with the developing fetus. If the oxytocin system if the oxytocin system is not functioning normally, it affects the development of the oxytocin system in the infant. This, of course, once the infant is born, can affect attachment behaviors. You have ongoing environmental influences so that this infant's adult attachment strategy long-term is affected. So you can see how both from an environmental perspective from early childhood, consistent with the ACEs studies, all the way to the neuroendocrine system of attachment. This has a significant impact on the healthy relationship that the woman has not only with others in her peer group, but also with her newborn infant. So just in case you haven't gotten the point, it's all about relationships. And really, that's what gender-specific treatment is all about. How do we develop relationships so that women begin to trust us as their as their therapists, as their counselors, and at the same time maintain the boundaries that are necessary for successful therapeutic interventions. And of course, what makes it all the more complicated when we're talking about pregnant women is we have to consider how our therapy and how our work with the mother is affecting her relationship with her child. Now, this research I'm getting ready to show you is based on the mother-child relationship evaluation. It's a published instrument. And it looks at 4 measures as far as a woman's relationship, potential relationship with her child. The 4 domains are acceptance, rejection, overprotection, or overindulgence. Acceptance is, does the woman have respect for her child as an individual? And what level of attachment is there between the mother and child? Rejection shows up in those women who express a denial of love and may in fact express some hate by neglect, being harsh with the infant, brutality, and strictness. Overprotection is when the mother has excessive control over the child and in fact prevents the normal development of independent behavior in the child because of this feeling of overprotection. And clinically, in my case, I've seen it's been usually associated with trying to overcompensate for the harm the woman feels like she has caused in her child because of her substance abuse. And then on the other hand, there is overindulgence. An excessive amount of time is given to the child, and the woman is showing that she really has no real control over the child's behaviors. Now, let me just mention here, these studies can be done with men also. We have not done those studies. So the data I'm going to show you are only on women who were in our treatment programs, were in substance abuse treatment, were in recovery, and then once they had their child, we looked at their attitudes toward the child. And here's what we found. The level, the most common level, the average level of acceptance in the women was right around 50th percentile. So acceptance was okay. Rejection also was at the 50th percentile. Now think about that a minute. Then overprotection was at the 87th, and overindulgence was at the 79th. So what you see here is there seem to be equal amounts of acceptance and rejection and equal amounts of overprotection and overindulgence showing up in the women. What does this do? It results in what many of you have seen in the women you work with, which is inconsistent parenting. The women keep vacillating from being overprotective and being very strict to overindulgence and being very lax. Blaming the child for behaviors, or at the other extreme, ignoring those behaviors, punishing the child versus overindulgence. And so we know in our work in child development that children need consistent parenting. And in our own work, what we found is that it's not about going step by step. Here's how you go to be a good parent. Here's how you intervene in behaviors. It's really a factor of working with the woman so that she comes to terms as far as her relationship with her child. And what you want to do ultimately is help her achieve a level of consistent parenting. Looking at the broader scope and putting this all together, a woman with a negative heritage who did not have a chance to have anyone model for her how to be a good parent, who has a history of trauma with resulting emotional instability, psychological dysfunction, cognitive deficits from her history of substance abuse, all the while being socially isolated. That's when you see this parenting dysfunction and this inconsistency with how the woman is approaching her child. So I hope you see from this that our treatment approaches and our psychoeducational approaches have to address the woman's needs in order to help her be the very best mother she can and achieve successful sobriety. So we turn now to treatment. And what drives a woman toward treatment, successful treatment? And one of the questions that was asked, that was published back in 2002, was what burdens affect women, pregnant women who are in drug treatment, and do those burdens affect the woman's likelihood to make it all the way through treatment? So this was a group of 286 pregnant women, all with significant histories of alcohol and drug abuse, with a pretty diverse racial and ethnic background. Some of the burdens they looked at were mental health problems, homelessness, HIV positive, domestic violence, cognitive disabilities, and health problems. And you can see here from this bar graph that there were significant levels of these so-called burdens in this population of women. About 25% had mental health problems, 60% were homeless, 10% were HIV positive, 88% had histories of domestic violence, 20% cognitive disabilities, and other health problems in close to 90%. So you can see this population is probably quite similar to the populations many of you work with. Now, what they did was the next question they asked was, how many burdens do the women have? About 35% had less than 3 burdens, and about 62% had 3 or more burdens. And what they found is that the more burdens they had, the shorter time they stayed in treatment. So the women with multiple burdens, you can see, are at the far end of this graph, and with the fewer burdens, number of burdens, the line falls. And so the next question was, okay, is there any one burden that tells us this woman is going to be ready to change? Now, when they looked at all of the burdens together, there was no generalized readiness to change. So that is, the more burdens there were, the more likely the woman was ready to change her behaviors. That did not hold out. And that reflects what we saw in the previous slide. However, when they looked at the individual burdens, what they found was the one burden that did predict readiness to change, treatment readiness, was domestic violence. The other issues did not reach statistically significant levels, but if a woman was suffering domestic violence, that was the one factor that made her most likely to enter treatment and stay in treatment. Now, taking all of these issues together, we have to consider the traditional drug treatment model. The traditional model, be selfish, focus on your sobriety. That traditional model isolates the woman from the relational context. And in fact, relational issues often are seen as a distraction from the real issue of attaining sobriety. And the outcome measure that programs use is relapse. You can see how this evolved from the classic male model of treatment, grounded in the 12-step process. But this does not work for women. You cannot isolate women from their relational context. As we said, women's lives revolve around relationships. and where you can find a man often will be able to enter treatment, the first question a woman asks when you say, let's get into treatment, her first question is, what do I do with my children? And then if a woman has a newborn infant, if you take that infant away from her so that she can enter a treatment program, you have separated her from the one factor that may in fact drive her determination to become drug-free. And we know there are many other outcomes to be looked at besides just relapse. So what do we know about women's recovery? Women recover through positive, supportive relationships that strengthen ties to children and families. There have been several different studies looking at residential treatment and allowing women to bring their newborn infants into treatment versus separating them from their infants. And it's been shown that when the women have when women have the opportunity to bring their children into treatment with them, they do better. We know that the longer the length of treatment, the higher the rate of sobriety and the lower the rate of relapse. And we often know relapse is part of recovery. And in our own work, we found that relapse is often linked to stages of the child's development. And I'll give you just one example of this. We found that women in our residential and outpatient programs, we had pretty good rates of success in getting them off drugs and alcohol, successful pregnancy outcomes. We continue to follow them. But we found that it was not uncommon for the women to relapse right around 18 months after delivery. And the pattern was so consistent, we couldn't quite figure it out at first. But as we talked with the women, what we found is that this was linked to the child's progressive independence. Because think of child development. It's usually around a year to 18 months that the child is learning to walk, learning to talk, and at 18 months is moving toward what people call the terrible twos. The child has learned to say no. So the women who had been working hard to be good mothers found that by 18 months of age, the babies were running away from them and saying no. They were expressing their independence. And this was very hurtful for the women. And so we had to revise the way we look at this stage of child development and emphasize to the women that in fact when your child is running away, when your child is saying no, congratulations, you're a good mother. You have brought your child to the point of developing independence. And so you have to look at the way you present developmental information to the women. This goes back to the classic Maslow hierarchy. You have to meet women's physiologic needs, especially homelessness. You have to ensure their safety. As I mentioned, domestic violence is a driving factor. They need relationships, a sense of belonging. If you can achieve these three basic factors through your treatment approach for women, you're going to move them to the phase of growth that is self-actualization, feelings of enhanced self-esteem. That's how you achieve successful treatment. I think the one author who has written the most and the best about this topic is Stephanie Covington, and I would highly recommend you look at any of her work. I particularly like her book, 12 Steps for Women. And through this book and others, she emphasizes the need for safety, allowing women the phase of remembrance and mourning, and then finally the chance to reconnect. One other aspect that we have found in our own work, and this comes up quite often, we not only have to help the women therapeutically, we have to teach them, we have to give them concrete information. And so we turn to the educational literature. So if we think about the cognitive difficulties in adults with a history of substance abuse and how we can help teach basic concepts and change behavior Through our own work, we have found there are three factors that you have to take into mind. Repetition, especially if you have changes in the brain due to long-term alcohol abuse or use of drugs such as methamphetamine or cocaine. The key to education is repeat, repeat, repeat. You have to be very concrete and use specific language, and most of all, you have to be consistent in your approach. Now, how do you put that into play? And so this is one of the strategies we've taken. It's built on research with this population of women. It's for working with pregnant women, and it's a step-by-step approach each month of the pregnancy. And so I'm just going to show you a couple of pages from it. And I hope what this does is show you how we've used those basic principles of education. So example, if a woman is 13 to 16 weeks, you turn to this page in the book. It's more of the size of a curriculum. And you can point out to the woman, first of all, the pictures of the fetus at that point. Now, at 13 to 16 weeks, I can tell you that the great majority of women that you're working with have no idea what the fetus looks like. And being able to point out the very human characteristics, the eyelids, the ears, the umbilical cord, that's very concrete information. And then you can tell them the script is right below for you. At 13 to 16 weeks, here are the things that are happening. The baby's hair and teeth are beginning to form. The first stools are beginning to form. Sex organs. The baby is 5 to 7 inches long. So you can give a very concrete example. On the opposite side of the page is the instructions for you as the provider. And it gives you some points that you can begin to point out to the woman as you talk at 13 to 16 weeks. And then it says at the bottom, you can say, now, if you don't drink right now, which is around the 4th month of pregnancy, all the things that happen are here. So that's positive reinforcement. If necessary, you can say, if you are drinking in the 4th month, here are the kinds of things that can happen. So we have very specific information. So it's concrete. You can go back to this frequently, so it's repetitive. It's very visual, so it uses what we call multi-sensory input, both auditory and visual input, and it's consistent. It gives you a clear script. Now that's 13 to 16 weeks. Let's skip over. Here's 17 to 20. Again, you can see the same kind of thing. A picture of the fetus. These are incredible pictures of the fetus. This curriculum is worth it just for these pictures. They're just amazing. But it shows you at 17 to 20 weeks what actually is growing, what's happening. It shows you on the opposite page the kinds of things you can talk about, a script of how to approach the woman about it. And then again, if you don't drink in the 5th month or if you do drink in the 5th month. So you can use as much or as little of these scripts as you wish. And this goes all the way, it starts well before 16 weeks, and it goes all the way through term, month by month. And again, this is all built on educational principles and grounded in the research that has been done. We have found in our own work that this not only helps build educational or a knowledge base for the women understanding what's going on in their pregnancy, we have found it also has a significant impact on attachment. So one of the things we later added was a small version of this same book that you give to the mother. The left side of the page, as you're looking at it, is the same as here. But on the other side of the page, it has a question for the mother. So for example, if it's the week, you're showing the mother a picture during the period when the baby's legs are developing. There's a picture of a child and it says, "Mommy, where will we walk together?" And then there's space for the mother to write a note to her child as to where they'll walk together. So the woman keeps that booklet, and at the end of pregnancy, she has a complete diary of conversations with her developing fetus. So it builds a feeling of a relationship that becomes very real. And I will tell you that one of the groups that most specifically likes this curriculum are adolescents. So if you're working with teens who are pregnant, you can use this with them, and it's a real eye opener for many of the young ladies. So here is a summary. What are the guiding principles of gender-specific treatment? First of all, you have to understand that gender does make a difference in the way we live the world and in the way we look at the world. As we work with these women, we have to create an environment that is grounded in safety and respect, so the women have some feeling of dignity. And we want to give comprehensive, integrated services that meet the needs culturally also. We have found that using the positive aspects of any individual's culture promotes the feelings of not only self-efficacy, but a feeling of community, where the woman came from and the future she's building for her child. Socioeconomic status, we want to provide opportunities to help the women move toward financial independence. Many of the women are dependent for finances on an abusive male, and so this issue has to be addressed. We have to find other community services that can support the family, and importantly, we have to remember it's all about relationships. So policies, practices, programs that enhance and build on relationships. Do not take children unnecessarily away from women with histories of substance abuse, but build systems that promote family survival. Now, these last guiding principles came from work done by the authors Bloom, Owen, and Covington, but you see they reflect very closely what we've been talking about this whole time. I want to thank you for attending this webinar, but certainly we're looking forward to next year. We've started putting the webinar series for next year together, controversies in perinatal substance exposure. And what I've tried to do, there are so many webinars out there that address the general topics. So for next year, I've tried to find the topics that people are afraid to talk about. And so our webinar series is going to be grounded in everything you wanted to talk about, but were afraid to talk about. So thank you all very much. I'll turn you back over to Gabe. I wish you a very happy holiday season and a splendid new year.